Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today we're going to be making a slimline card using the Piece of Cake stamp set as well as the Perfect Bricks stencil. So I'm starting off with my panel here, and this is a piece of Neenah Solar White, and I'm just drawing a pencil line with my ruler just as a guide as far as where I need to do my stamping. I'm going to do all of my stamping with an acrylic black rather than my Misty. I'm going to be using Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. I went ahead and stamped out a few of these strawberries, and then I will mask those out with some Simon Says stamp masking paper. Anything you want to be in front of another, you want to stamp and mask first. So I want there to be a couple of strawberries and cherries on this table in front of what will be the cupcakes. So I'm stamping a few at a time, masking them, and then stamping a few more and masking them once again. Once those were done, then I can go ahead and start stamping out my cupcakes, which will be the same. So anything you want in front of another will have to be stamped and masked first. Now, in this stamp set, there is one cupcake wrapper and two different cupcake tops. One with kind of like a twisty frosting and one with kind of just regular frosting. So I'm going to stamp out my first two images here, and they're going to be the cupcake wrappers. Then I will go ahead and stamp out the top portion of these cupcakes. Then I did cut masks prior to filming, and I cut them in two separate pieces. Now these masks will overlap a little bit, but to be honest with you, I'm not all that worried about it. The only reason why I need to mask the bottom portion is because I'm going to be stamping more cupcakes. The top portion will have some ink blending, so you want to make sure that your masks are cut as close to the black line or directly on the black outline of the image, so that when you do your ink blending, you don't have that white outline around your images. I know a lot of people use a scan and cut to cut out their masks. For me, that doesn't really work well, especially when I am doing ink blending. It just doesn't cut it as perfect as I need it to be. So I'd rather just fussy cut them on my own. So I'm going to stamp out the remaining cupcake wrappers here and move on to the second top of the cupcakes. And these are super easy to line up. The lines just kind of meet together, so it doesn't really take a stamp positioner. It's very easy to line up. So I'm going to go ahead and mask those additional cupcakes out. I really didn't need to mask the wrappers, but I did anyway because they were cut. Then I will go ahead and do my ink blending. I'm going to take a piece of Post-it note tape and line that directly on that pencil line that I can barely see anymore, but I'm just using my grid mat here to make sure that that's lined up. I did also put a piece on the bottom just because I don't trust myself going beyond that Post-it note tape, but that's totally optional. Next, I'm going to bring in some Spun Sugar Distress Oxide ink, and I'm going to be using a blending brush here, and all I'm doing is I am starting off on my masks and kind of working my way up. So the top portion of the card panel is going to be the lightest. So you'll see that I often tap off on my scrap piece of paper so that I don't have too much ink on my ink blending tool or my blending brush. And I'm working right from the cupcakes and kind of working my way up. Once I get to the other side of the card panel, I can kind of see if it's even, but being I'm using a stencil, it really doesn't matter too much. Now, obviously, stencils are 6x6 usually, and this is not a 6x6 piece of paper. So as long as you use a very simple pattern, it's easy to line up and you can easily use a stencil for a slimline card. So once I had my spun sugar down, I did let it dry for a minute or two so that my stencil can stick to it easily. And I am using the Pixie spray on the back of the stencil. And you want to let that dry for a minute anyway before placing that down onto your card panel. But that way, because it's such an intricate stencil, it won't shift around as I'm doing my ink blending. So I'm going to go ahead and place that down on the left-hand side of my card panel and make sure that's really stuck down. And then I'm going to bring out the Worn Lipstick Distress Oxide. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just starting off on those masks and kind of working my way up to the top so that the top portion of the card panel will be significantly lighter. And I am tapping off on my scrap piece of paper first. Then I can go ahead and lift up my stencil, make sure I have good coverage, and then shift it. And I am overlapping my pattern here because that way I can line it up perfectly and it looks like I just used one gigantic stencil for the background. And like I said, a pattern like this is very easy to realign, where if you use something that's kind of wonky or not a repetitive pattern, it may be a little bit more difficult. So once all of my ink blending was done, I let that ink dry for a few minutes before removing my masks. Especially if you're using paper masks, it tends to stay wet a little bit because we have so much ink on the masks that when you go to remove them, sometimes the mask will tear, but it will also tear the paper as you go along. So I'm using a pair of scissors. I'm just using the tip of my scissors to remove all of my masks. Not only will the masks kind of remove all in one piece, or hopefully all in one piece, but I'm also wearing nail polish. And if you've ever scraped your nail across your card panel and left a big streak of nail polish, yes, you can get it up with a sand eraser, but sometimes when you color over an area that you've used that sand eraser, it looks a little funny. It looks a little bit rough, and I wanted to avoid that. So just using something sharp like the tip of your scissors to start by removing your masks, it makes it a lot easier. I'm just going to draw a line with a Copic Safe pen just on the corners there where my table, I guess, would be. And then you want to make sure that you erase all of those pencil lines before you do your coloring. So I'm not going to show you all of the coloring here, but because it is a lot of repetitive coloring, but I am going to show you a little bit of it. So for the cupcake wrappers, I'm going to bring out some C markers, and there's already lines where the cupcake wrapper would be either dipped in or dipped out, and all I'm really doing is tracing it. So I'm taking my C5 and tracing those lines, and I'm also creating a shadow where one image is laying in front of another. So where these cherries are in front of this cupcake wrapper, then I'm going to extend those lines out a little bit with the C3 on both sides so that this will look like the area that's kind of indented into the cupcake, and also extending that shadow out where the cherries are in front. Next, I'll bring out the C1 and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just extending those lines out a little bit further, as well as that shadow. And I colored all of the cupcake wrappers the same exact way. Next, we'll move on to the cupcake portion itself. And I wanted some of these to be chocolate and some of them to be, I guess, yellow cake. So I'm going to use pretty much the same color combination with the exception of the darkest color. So my E21 will be the lightest color for both of them. For the chocolate, I am bringing in the E29 and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to either side. Then I'm going to blend that out with the E25 and just extend that towards the middle. Same thing with the E23, and you'll see that I'm just leaving a teeny tiny bit of a highlight on the chocolate cupcakes for that E21 that we started with. Now for the other cupcakes where I want these to be like yellow cake, you guys know once you bake it, it does become a lot darker. So I am going to use that E21 to saturate the paper again, but I'm going to skip the E29 this time and go right in with the E25 on either side, blend that out with the E23, and you'll see that I'm leaving a much larger highlight for that E21. Next, we're going to move on to the frosting, and for the one with the sprinkles, I want this to be vanilla frosting. So it would be white, but I still want to add a little bit of shading. So I'm going to use those same markers that we used for the cupcake wrappers, and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to either side with that C5, and I'll blend that out a little bit with the C3 and C1, and you can see that I'm leaving a whole lot of white space here. But being C1 is my lightest gray color or cool gray color, I have kind of a harsh line between the C1 and the white area. So I'm just going to take my colorless blender and just smooth that area out. Now for the chocolate frosting, I'm going to move on to some E50 markers, going to map out the darkest areas with my lightest color. And also this gets the paper saturated so that the colors will blend a little bit easier. I'm going to go in with the E59 and I'm just adding a little bit of shading where one swirl, I guess, of the frosting would be overlapping another because it would be laying on underneath it. So that would create a shadow. That would be your darkest area. I'm also adding a little bit of shading on either side where I have room to, and then I'll blend that out a little bit with the E57, and I'm just extending these areas out a little bit further. Next will be the E55, and then I'll finish off with the E53 again, which is the one that we started out with, just to map out those areas. So I went ahead and colored these other ones the same way, kept the vanilla, and the chocolate with the same color combinations. And during this process, or as I was about to start the table portion and the strawberries and cherries, my cat jumped on the table. So I had turned off my camera and then forgot to turn it back on. So I'm leaving the coloring in of the remaining cupcakes for the frosting, but quite honestly, it's just the same. But I'm just going to explain to you how I did the table and the strawberries and cherries. So for the table, I used some warm grays. I just created a shadow with a W5 underneath each one of the cupcakes, cherries, and strawberries, and added a little bit of shading towards the back of the table. I blended that out with the W3, W1, and then again used that colorless blender just to make sure that everything was a little bit smoother. For the strawberries, I used the R46 as my darkest color, blended that out with the R24, R22, and R20. For the stem, and I guess you would call it the leaves, I just used a G29 and G24. For the cherries, I used almost the same color combination as I used for the strawberries, but just stepped it up a little bit darker and used the R89 as my darkest, blended that out with the R46, R24, and R22 as my highlight color. Now, I typically add some white gel pen details and highlights to most of my coloring projects to kind of boost up the coloring, but I wanted to add even more gel pen details to this particular card, especially with the cupcakes that have those little sprinkles on it, which, by the way, are like my favorite things in the world. So I am going to bring out some gel pens that I've had in my stash for, I can't even tell you how long. These are the Jelly Roll gel pens. I think I purchased a bunch of them to do those adult coloring books, but never ended up using them because I prefer to just use pencils and markers. So I'm going to take a pink and a red gel pen here, and I'm just going to go over those little dash lines that are the sprinkles, and I'm just going to kind of spread them out. I know this kind of looks Valentine's Day like, but this matches the background as well as the strawberries and cherries. So not only will this add a little bit of color, but it will also add a little bit of texture to these sprinkles. I also used my white gel pen to add some highlights to all of the strawberries and cherries, as well as some of these swirly areas of the frosting. And again, this will kind of just boost up your coloring and make it, give it a little bit more dimension than it has with just the plain coloring. Next, for the sentiment, I had planned on using several different sentiments from the stamp set. You can kind of mix and match them, or you can just use one or two by themselves, but I wanted to use many of them. But I didn't really leave myself enough room on the card panel itself. I am going to bring out my Misty here, and I'm going to use the brick background, or the pattern in the background, to line up my sentiments. Because I aligned my stencil using the edges, I guess you could say, of the card panel, these are perfectly straight. So it's a perfect way to line up your sentiments, know they are straight before stamping them out. I also make sure that once I close my Misty door that they do line up with the grid lines on my Misty as well, just to make sure before I actually do my stamping. I am going to stamp this with Hot Lips ink by Simon Says Stamp. I did stamp it twice just because of the background. I felt like it just wasn't bold enough. So stamping it twice will just make it a little bit darker and make it stand out a little bit more. Next, I added a little bit of shimmer with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen just to the chocolate frosting. You want to be careful not to go over too many times your gel pen with a shimmer pen, just because it will smear that the gel pen. And that's why I didn't add it to the vanilla frosting. Also added a few gems around the sentiment, and then I adhered this down to my card base. And I know I get a lot of questions what size my card base is for a slimline card. And I know there's probably different sizes that people use, but mine is just shy of 4 inches tall, and the length of it is 8.5. But that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave all of the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.